Good evening. Welcome to the French Institute. I am Floriane Lorichès, Head of Libraries, and I am delighted to welcome Vinciane Despret and Garry Marvin for a discussion tonight. This discussion is part of our series, The Earth Here and Now, in partnership with publishing house Polity, coinciding with the COP26 currently held in Glasgow. As you may know, Vinciane Despret is a Belgian philosopher of science and professor at the University of Liège. Her work offers new approaches to human-animal relations. She is considered to be a major thinker in what we call animal studies. Garry Marvin is a social anthropologist and professor of human-animal studies at the University of Roehampton. He has conducted research into and published on a variety of practices involving the engagement of humans and other animals. Tonight, they will discuss Vinciane's book, Living as Bird, beautifully translated into English by Helen Morrison. Vinciane, Garry, the floor is yours.
And so we'll start with a macro level and then talk about Vinciane's work as a philosopher and then come to the book, have some time for questions from people if you want to ask points. So as a social anthropologist with research focus on human animal studies, for me, a key aspect, a really important one, is your mode of question and your generation of new perspectives that help me and other people think differently and generate new questions. And a range of these are set out wonderfully in your earlier book, which is titled, What Would Animals Say If We Asked Them the Right Questions? So I'm going to pick up some things from the book rather than direct questions. So a couple of short quotes from you, Vinciane. You said, interesting research is research conducted under conditions that make beings interesting. And when we were speaking earlier in preparation for this, you commented, most of the interesting questions with humans as I know them are, quote, if I say something, what would you think about? This engages directly with thinking and allows or invites the questioner to take interesting risks. As a philosopher, there might have been very well mapped fields for you to engage in. Animal mind, consciousness, subjectivities, agencies, awareness. But you've taken a different path, a set of pathways in your philosophical ecology that includes engagements with philosophy, yes, but also perspectives of zoology, biology, ethology, ecology. So it's a rather long way of asking you what it is about something that attracts your attention and then stimulates your thinking, then your research, and then your writing. So it's a long way into the question.
Long way. Okay, so first, thank you to you, Garry. Thank you to Helen. It makes the pleasure to be with us. And thank you to the French Institute, because it was a very great honor and pleasure for me to come back to London after too long absence. And I would answer the question that my first point, what interests me, what really makes me think something happened here, because that's the way it is. It was years ago when I met ethology. And I didn't meet ethology, I met ethologists. So I was following, I've been studying philosophy, and I have to say that my relationship with philosophy has been for long kind of love-hate relationship. Sometimes they're so complicated, sometimes they're so arrogant. Sometimes they're so boring. And sometimes I read philosophy and I say, so what? What am I concerned by this big question? Men are different than animals, for example. Or men know that he's dying, that he will die, and so on. And say, what do they know that? And how are we concerned by that? So my relationship with philosophy was a kind of troublesome relationship. And I decided to study psychology, not because I have a bad relationship with philosophy. It was only that when you're in Belgium, back to that time, if you study philosophy, the sure way, you got the surest way to be in unemployment, to go to the chômage bureau. So that's exactly what's happened. And so after 3 years of being, doing nothing of my life and understanding that it might last for years and years, that I decided to have a diploma that could help me just to work. And I decided to study psychology. And back to that time, to be clinician was a good deal because always people need to be helped, let's say that way. And so I decided to study clinical psychology and to be a good therapist. And I never been the therapist, neither good, neither bad, because I met ethologists. And with ethologists, I met something that was so much more fun, so much more complicated, so much more strange than what I was learning about humans. Animals were so bizarre. And ethologists were so fantastic, interesting, because first of all, they learned to tell stories. And I didn't meet people telling so well good stories because they have to tell stories. And why do they have to tell stories? Because ethology, I would say now, is a kind of, okay, for those who didn't know what ethology is, it's just the basic definition is the study of the biology of behaviors. So as well as some functions has been selected by evolution, you can see that some behaviors has been selected. This is the classical definition. I don't agree with that definition, but that's the way ethologists generally agree about what they are doing. They're not really doing that, but they say they do that. If I would have to say a better definition of ethology, I would choose the one Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, the philosopher. I go back finally to philosophy after years of I feel at ease with some philosophers. And Gilles Deleuze says something very nice about ethology. It's a really interesting definition. He says that ethology is the practical science of what beings are able to, what creatures are able to, what is their power. And it's a fantastic definition because exactly what ethologists do, what this being, what this bear, what this lion, what this dog, what this bird is able to. It's fantastic because, so they need stories. I was meaning that because, why do they need stories? Because as you don't know exactly why they do what they do, you have to, so I say that ethology is one of the most speculative practical sciences. Because as soon as you see an animal do something, you have to imagine, why did he do that? Does she have one reason to do that, or much more reason like human have? What will be the consequences? What does he feel about what he's doing or she's doing, and so on and so on. It's and this kind of speculative means tools need stories, and ethologists were so good in telling short stories. I mean stories about what you see now, right now, and the very long stories of evolution, which is so interesting also. And so what attracted me with animals was not animals in themselves. It was first the stories people were telling. And after that, when I learned these stories and when I heard these stories and when I went, because that was a crucial point in my becoming philosopher with animals, it was that I have the great chance to go on the field with ethologists and to observe the babblers, which are some birds that live notably in the desert of Negev in Israel. And I've been following ethology and watching with them, observing with them, and hearing what they have to say, asking them a lot of questions. What do you see now? You see that? Or do you know that that is that story that we should tell and so on? And so it was, for me, it was the most interesting thing that happens to my life, which was to meet people being able to make the animals interesting. Is it okay?
Absolutely. Just going back to the philosophers, there's a nice line in the book where you said about the philosophers of animals they did not, in fact, display. They displayed a total lack of curiosity for real animals, even though these are often invoked in their work. And this is you speaking. For me, it felt as if the animals were being used as hostages in a problem that didn't concern them.
Yeah.
But
Okay, this was a problem I had since the beginning with animals. That when philosophers were talking about animals, mostly they were talking about symbols or representation. I mean, would you say representation? So, what do animals represent?
Yeah.
They are not there for themselves. So, a cat is, I don't know, a bear is a sign of sexuality. You know that a wolf of voracity, and a sheep of obedience or sheepish behavior, and so on and so on. And so philosophers could not imagine to think 1 minute about the real animals and what they have to the way they are, the way they live, the power they have, what they are capable of, and so on. And so I've been very, very attentive and cautious about that, to not let prevent philosopher from doing that. And I say that I understand that they could do that 10 or 20 years ago because everybody was doing that, except that Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, just point out the real problem of philosophy, to do that and to say that animals were only for text, for pretext. And when they do that now, I cannot accept anymore, because they know that it's other ways to consider animals, to study them. And for example, I've been confronted first with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. I love their work. Living as a bird is so much influenced by them. But when, for example, they say that they don't like dogs or cats, that they cannot stand dogs or cats because they are the familiar animals and because they are some big mama with little cute dogs and so on, I say they shouldn't do that because they are so arrogant, and they take these animals in hostage. Why do they take in hostage? Because I can understand what they do. They are contesting the psychoanalytical framework that gives some in relationship that give identities to people, and that the animals are considered in the same framework as mother in Oedipal and so on. So I can understand. But they take animals in hostage of their own problems. And I think that they might have not to. And the second one was Michel Serres. And again, I love Michel Serres. I've been reading, I'm an enthusiastic reader of the French philosopher Michel Serres. I love Le Contrat Naturel. I love Darwin Bonaparte and the Good Samaritan. I don't know if they've been translated. Contrat Naturel, I'm sure that it has been translated. The other one. I love all the proposition is so daring, is so imaginative. But when he wrote the book called Le Malpropre, I don't know if it has been translated, Hélène. Yeah. Okay. And I read that because I was preparing the field of, I was preparing. My question was, will I work on territory or not? Because somebody asked me to work on that subject, and I say, I'm not sure, because politically, this subject, this issue is so loaded, is so dangerous, because it brings with it so much ideas of private property, borders, frontiers, wars, appropriation, and so on. I was not sure I wanted to work on that. And so I was reading a lot of things to know, where do I go? Where do I go? Yes, exactly. Which path will I be forced to take if I choose this issue? And I read Michel Serres, and I was really mad at him. And I was really mad because he says things like that the animals, for example, the tiger which urinates, on his territories, or the dogs okay. The things was that he says that animals salir, dirt,
Sully, pollute.
pollute some places to make this place their own territory, like we do. And he has an expression like we say, we split in the soup so nobody will want to eat it. And I say, he cannot do that. This is taking animals in hostage, because animals don't pollute. We do pollute, but animals don't pollute. I mean, if you see an animal which urinate, it's not dirt at all. I mean, it's not disgusting. It's just writing. This is a writing strategy. When an animal urinates, some places to signify to others, I came by, I am a big male or a little female, I am interested now to meet someone, and so on. And, a lot of things can. So it's not pollution at all. It's just writing. And I was so sad that it took animal in hostage of a problem that I couldn't understand, because Serre wrote this book to contest the right some people have take to pollute the common place, the common field, the common house, the common atmosphere, and so on.
What I like about your work is, so often when I've listened to philosophers talk, they talk about the animal, animal. And I don't know what the animal eats, or where the animal lives, or whether the animal has. And so what is wonderful in your work is the particularities. And as a social anthropologist, I go for cultural particularity. So it's could we talk through the book as a book? You've got major chapters on territories, on affects, overpopulation, possession, aggression, and polyphonous voices. And then between sections, which are called counterpoint. So could you sort of talk us how you came through to this structure, and how does the counterpoint at the end of each chapter work for you? Or what work are you trying to do?
Okay, I chose counterpoint first because it was a musical metaphor. And so I wanted this book be intimately linked with two things, and two things having to do with beauty. The beauty of the song of the birds, and the beauty of what they're doing when they, flight. It's beautiful choreography. Sometimes they can display, and it's beautiful, even if it's sometimes pretty hard, because they display harshly and pretty rudely in conflict. But I didn't want to forget beauty, and so it was kind of what we call talisman in French, memento. Don't forget, like a node in the handkerchief, we say also. And so, from me giving this kind of title, it was a way to remind, like a memento, like a mantra, beauty and song are what should lead me if I want to study territory. Because if I can say that the birds, let's say a blackbird, sings its territory, I can also say that this territory is singing through the blackbirds, or is making the blackbird sing. I mean, and both can be, and the third things can be said. So for me, counterpoint. Secondly, the counterpoint where it was between chapters, and it was another voice, like in contemporary music. It was in another voice which was answering to the first voice, adding something, but trying to keep the same thread, the same path, walking, but at different rhythm with different stuff. And in the contemporary, mostly, in the chapter itself, I was only talking about birds. And it was, and not about birds in general, it was about the redbreast, it was about the blackbird, it was about the sparrows, it was, okay. And in the counterpoint, sometimes I needed some tools. I needed, for example, okay, if territory might be something like an institution, what would be the link between what we call an institution and what is it, a territory? So I am going to answer to that question, to make this analogy, I cannot stay with the birds anymore. I have to go to the primates or to the humans, try to understand how does it function. And then, so when it was only to help me, to bring me tools or to contest some methodologies and so on, and that seemed to me that it didn't really concern bird, that bird would say, we don't have anything to say with that. That's not our problem. But it was my problem.
Mm-hmm.
I needed these tools to understand what's happened with the birds.
One thing that I think I'm very powerful in your work is the notion of drawing attention to things. And as you phrase it, not going the harsh spotlight of explanation. So, in the sense, is it right in your work on the birds? Have you explained, or is explanation less important to you than drawing attention to different perspective?
Yeah. Okay, I can answer that by two paths, and I will choose the historical one. I discover the terrible burden of explanation upon the shoulders of people about whom you explain something. When I wrote the book about the relationship people continue to entertain with their dad. So when I was writing Our Grateful Dead, in the French version, of course, I discovered that people were telling me very interesting stories about what they were doing. For example, they were saying that something like, I still wear the shoes of my grandmother so she can still walk in the world, which is beautiful. So what do you do after that? Are you going to explain what's happened to that person? If you explain, you completely impoverish what this person said. You completely impoverish, you completely, I would say, écraser the story. You just put something on it, like, a cover on it. So, yes, you crush it. And so I decided that I had to find other ways, not to explain, but to find other ways to be in dialogue with these stories. And it was narrative strategies. And so at least what I could do is, when I have a story that interests me, did I meet another story that can answer to that story, on that give light, a certain light on that story. And then I consider that finally what I had learned about the relationship between the left behind and the dead could also work for birds. Because if you take biologists, I understand that they do. And for example, what do birds do a territory? Oh, because this is the instinct. So you have an explanation. But what did you explain? Nothing. I mean, not only you didn't explain anything, but in plus, you were just saying that the birds obey to some physiological determinism, and that, I mean, no matter what his motive can be, they will completely be impoverished by the instinct as talk. And so finally, I decided that instead of trying to find, because the problem of explanation, this is the first problem, it gives so much determinism in the situation, it gives so much power to the determinism in the situation, that you finally find the bird without any kind of agency. It's just, is passive, obeying the law of nature. That's the first point. And the second point is that with an explanation, you miss something first, because the problem with explanation, it's Tom Van Doren made me learn to see that. When, for example, a scientist says, okay, let's take an example. Why do ravens share their food, call for other ravens when they find a big carcass? Why do they do that? It should better to keep that for them, for themselves, and just be silent. And so the scientific will try to know. Maybe they do that because the carcass is too big, and they hope that in the next future, the other one will do that, which is called reciprocity. Maybe they do that because they're scared, because, a carcass might be not a carcass. And it's better to have friends with you, even to say, go ahead, eat first. Maybe, so they find a lot of reasons. Maybe because they are on the territories of other birds, of another couple, and if they are if they are numerous enough, they will be able to protect the carcass against the territorial couple. And so they will eat quietly. A lot of reasons. And finally, the scientist says, okay, the best reason is that one. In that case, it is because it helps to prevent the couple, to make them to fight them and to make them go away. And we said, we stand that why wouldn't birds have much more reason than one to behave? And the problem of explanation, it's always that finally the use of thinking in terms of competition that biologists have very often make them even think in terms of competition with the explanation. One has to be the best. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem with explanation, that you never, it's so hard with explanation to have a kind, what I would call a polyphony of narratives. Is it clear? Mm-hmm. You sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to end on this point, perhaps open it up. A quotation in your book from your friend and colleague, Isabel Stengers. You're quoting her. Learning to know something, she says, means learning to discriminate, learning to recognize what matters, learning how difference helps, and learning all that in the encounter, in the context of the encounter with all its attendant risks, consequences. In other words, it means connecting with the inherent plurality of what matters for these particular beings, the ones we're trying to get to know, and of what matters for them. It is an art of consequences. Yeah, it's just one that just reflect on it. I found it a very powerful.
It is. I would say that it's a very much. It bears the signature of William James in that case. The signature of William James and of course of Whitehead. But from me, that thing that's funny with Isabel, that when I read Isabel Stengers, I discovered that something that I felt but I could not say. For example, that I could not about what I could not find words, but that I was really feeling deeply. That, for example, that if something matters for a bird, the least I can do, and not me, but the least an ethologist can do, is to show what matters, or to try to feel what matters, and to try to take into account that something matters to that bird, for example, to that precise bird. And so when I read Isabel Stengers, I was having this feeling, because when it was after, I read Isabel Stengers after my first field work with the babblers in Israel, and I noticed that if I follow Amos Zahavi, who was the real connoisseur of the babblers, because he worked with them for almost 50 years or something like that. And I could follow him on the field, and some other days, once in a while, I was also following sociobiologists from Cambridge or Oxford. And I noticed that the stories they were telling about babblers were not the same, and what they were observing were not the same. And I felt that for Zahavi, what he was trying to understand, say, what matters to the babblers. And I noticed that with that question, I could see with him a lot of things I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I mean, when you observe birds, I'm not a real ethologist, and it works as well with birds, with dogs, with sheep. I noticed that if I'm on the field, with, for example, with sheep, Thelma Roel, who lives in the north of England, and observing sheep for a few years now, after observing primates for all her career, she observed sheep. And for example, she says to me, "Did you see that?" I didn't see anything. Just a sheep did that. And I didn't notice it because it was not important, because it didn't have any signification for me. And I say, "Oh, what does he do? Does he breathe?" He says, "No, wait." After 5 minutes, another sheep stand up and wait a little bit. With sheep, you have to have a long time, but you know that. And after 3 or 4 minutes and so on, another sheep. And all of a sudden, all the sheep, the male sheep, get up on their feet and go on the direction. It was a conversation. The first sheep say, "We should go that way." And the second one suddenly say, "I would agree." And the third one, "Let's go so." And when they have what we call a quorum, and the quorum is not it's not a political quorum in the sense that sheep hates to be alone. And though if you have 4 or 5 sheep that decide to go, the other will go too. So finally they say, "Yes, let's go." And so I didn't see that, and I would never have seen that the other one were doing that. And it was the same with birds, which I mean that sometimes Avi says, "I think that they did that." And I say, "Why did you say, why do you say that? What helped you to say that? What support what you say?" And he says, "Did you say that?" "Of course I didn't see that." So it means that with some stories, you can see things that you wouldn't see if you wouldn't have the same narrative. And I was working with other scientists who were working in much more orthodox way, saying we cannot speculate if you don't have experimentation on the field and so on and so on. And I noticed that it was interesting. I wouldn't say that it was not. But I didn't learn to see things with them as much as I did with Ivy. And I don't know why I say that, because I forgot the question. Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Oh, it was with Isabel Stengers and what matters and so on.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, for example, Isabel told me that with Shirley Strum, the primatologist, she says that she discovered much more things about the baboons she observed in Kenya in the 17th when she changed the question. She didn't ask them, what is hierarchy? Who is the dominant? What do males do to constrain females and so on? She asked the question, and it was very important, which was, what are the questions the baboons are constantly asking to other baboons and to themselves? And as soon as she decided that it was the question she would raise about baboons, she learned a lot of things that completely contradict everything she was believing about baboons before that.
People come to listen to Vinciane, and people got questions.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I'm an ethologist myself, so I'm very interested by your point of view. And I like the definition you gave at the beginning, saying that ethologists were interested in, well, the definition by Deleuze that you mentioned. What is interesting is what animals are able to. And I do not agree totally with what you said about trying to find explanations. But the second part of what you said about observation, this is really the interest, I think, of ethologists, of good ethologists who are not seeking for explanation, but try to understand just by observation. And also you mentioned the instinct, and I think that now a lot of things are known about learning and culture, even in birds, as you know. And this is, I think, a new avenues for research. And then what you said about the last example you gave about baboons and about the fact that a woman saw things that the predecessor didn't see, especially in primates, is related also with the status of the observer. When it was men, they were mainly interested in hierarchy, power, relations among the society. Yeah? And when women started to look at these same societies of baboons or primates, they started to look at social relations, maternal behaviors, totally different things. And they discovered new things, as you know. So these are comments, but I have a question for you. It's more about culture and feelings that animals can have. And you are probably aware of these behavior of crows. When there is a death, when a crow is dead, there is something which I think nobody knows exactly what's happening there. They join around and they spend some time around before they fly away. And for me, this is something which has a lot of, meaning. And I have no explanation. I don't seek for explanation. I just observe the behavior.
I love that you observed that you dare to talk about that. Because remember also that years ago, no one would, among ethologists would have mentioned that something happened. They would have preferred not to say that in public. Maybe among ethologists, they could sometimes say, I see that with crowns and so on. And I think that Tom Van Doren says really interesting things. Tom Van Doren is a philosopher of environmental. Okay, thank you. Sorry?
And
Yes. And from environmental humanities in Australia. And he says that, I think that he dares as philosopher to say things ethologists wouldn't dare to say. That, for example, it says that, I think this is so interesting because we are going close to the issue of the COP26 now. That the problem of what's happened to us and Anthropocene is not only that extinction, that some species disappear. The problem is that some species see the world disappearing. And he says that about crows, we should imagine that that we might feel really, we might be, like Aldo Leopold say, we might bear porter le deuil, we might grieve for the disappearance of some species. But probably they also grieve, seeing all the companions disappearing and seeing all the world completely being more and more destroyed. And I think that's interesting to think that maybe crows and ravens can grieve for each other. And this is one of the proposals of Tom Van Doren, which I think is very interesting. And what is interesting is that ethologists give us the observation, and we philosophers might try to tell them, okay, we understand that you cannot say grief because it wouldn't be accepted in the scientific papers and peer review would jump on you and say no, that is not possible to do. But this is maybe interdisciplinarity, that you give us and you know what we will do with that. And I think that it's interesting to collaborate in that sense. Thank you. And about the primates, which is interesting, that women observe differently than men, of course. But it's less now because, not only because primatologist male, have been learning a lot with the female colleagues, but because what was also a possible cause of this difference between male and female, human female, is because women were staying much longer on the field for some political reasons, because as men could, after a few field works, they could try to get academical status, and they could get. Women didn't in the 60s, even in the beginning of the 70s, they didn't have any chance in the competition against male. So they didn't try. So they stay on the field. Or at least, I mean, if you see, for example, the field work of Washburn and Dover and so on, so they say they publish a book after 600 hours of field work. They were 600 hours, 300. And they publish a book and they have an academic status, because of that book. Well, not only because of that book. And women were staying, Thelma Rowell stayed with the baboons in Uganda from 63 to 69. You imagine the difference. And if you stay very long with animals, you know a lot of things you don't see because you get closer and closer, because you live among them, because you pay attention to little details. Where a male, we're observing from outside. And when you observe from outside, what you see, conflict, because that's the most spectacular that baboons can do. And so you have a lot of difference that came also only for socio-cultural and political reasons, which is interesting. Maybe a question to Ellen with Garry.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I'm not a specialist in this field, but I think that in the United Kingdom, the public's perception and imagination of animal behaviour is probably very influenced by the work of David Attenborough. And I'm curious, and especially thinking about COP26 and the need for us to have a greater and deeper engagement, understanding of the natural world, what your critique might be of Attenborough's work, whether you approve of it or whether you would do things differently.
About David Attenborough?
David Attenborough, yeah, because I think he shapes our, if we're not specialists, he shapes our perception of animal behaviour more strongly than anyone else in the UK at the moment. I was just curious.
It's difficult for me to answer to that question because, of course, I saw some David Attenborough documentary. They are really very good, but I don't know how did it shape the way you think about animals. What I can say that anyway, David Attenborough didn't come from nowhere in England because, I mean, we have such a cultural differences between French-speaking world and English-speaking world about animals. Because, I mean, birds, I mean, people from England know, a lot of people know a lot of things about birds. They observe them, they feed them, and so on. Garry, we are on your field now. And this is so different in France. This is so different. People really, a lot of people do not know anything about either birds, either plants, and so on and so on. So that, if you want to find, for example, naturalist amateur, you have a lot of excellent naturalist amateur in England, and women among them in the 19th centuries, in the beginning of the 20th, that you wouldn't find the equivalent in France. We have been in the country of Descartes. And we have been probably in the country, I think that maybe just an intuition, but that for the language, the question of language is such a burning question for philosopher in France, that I'm not sure that animals were not completely ignored or, because of this question of the taste we have, French people, for the language.
And a huge tradition of amateur natural history, ornithology. one more here. You were going to ask him.
Sorry. As a little child, I was always more comfortable with animals than with other people. I was very shy and could sit forever watching a bug crawl across a little patch of grass or up one blade of grass and down the other side. During the lockdown, I hadn't had much of a particular relationship with birds, but during the lockdown, I went to a churchyard every day, I thought was a churchyard, and sat in the grass and started eating bird seed, proper bird seed, not bread and crap, but bird seed, to a group of pigeons who lived in the churchyard, and they became my friends. They were wonderful. I could tell the difference in their personalities. There was one who had an injured beak, or possibly it was a birth defect, and was having difficulty. So she ate out of my hand. When she, after the New Year's Eve at that time, when people were shooting off fireworks, I never saw her again. And her partner, who was also just standing on my knee while she was eating out of my hand, he stopped coming around. I no longer saw him after a few days. I don't know if he died of grief. I don't know what happened, but I loved these birds. I loved them, and I still do. And it was such a wonderful thing for me, becoming friends with these pigeons. At the end of the lockdown, there were great big signs up. It turns out that this churchyard was actually part of the Royal Parks, and there were big signs put up, "No feeding the pigeons, by order of the police, £100 fine." And I could tell by the way the signs were printed that they meant it. And so out of fear, I had to stop. And I still miss them, but watching them, observing them, being aware of them and their behavior. And I just want to say that one day this man came, I was finished feeding them. They'd gone back up to the roof of the church. And this man, I was talking to a woman sitting on a bench there. And this man started yelling at me for feeding the birds. When this man started yelling at me, the birds flew down from the churchyard, or from the church roof, landed on my head, my shoulders, and it was as though they were saying, "Don't you pick on her." It felt very protective. And so I couldn't wait to come here tonight and to hear what you had to say about the birds and your observations of them and the relationship. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. I love them.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question to Ellen about translation, because
it was very interesting, and obviously as a translator, you're given a book. You're asked by your publishers, would you like to take this on? And it might be very different from the one you've done before. And I haven't translated anything quite like that before. And it actually made me look at the world in a different way. Not just, obviously there's a linguistic exercise going on there as you try to render someone's ideas and their words into another language. And Vinciane was fantastically supportive and gave me a lot of help. But it's also that as you're reading this text, I actually felt almost like she was chief explorer and I was kind of trotting along behind a little bit. And it is a fantastic experience, actually. And in this particular book, it was that sense of observing through the words that you're trying to translate, and also through the thinking that is behind those words. So, yeah, really.
thank you, because I know in plus that I am not easy to translate. I know it. And I know, for example, because my first book were easy to translate, but the two last ones are very difficult to translate because each word might sometimes mean 2 or 3 different things. And I remember, for example, part of it was so difficult and we could not find a solution. That in French, when I say, for example, in French, le territoire ne tient qu'à être chanté. In French, what does it mean in English? It's impossible to translate it because the word tenir means 2 things in French. in le tien, which means it is held by the fact that it is sung. Do I say it well? Oh, yes. But ne tient qu'à être chanté means also, quand on dit, when we say je tiens à, means it matters from me. And when I say le territoire ne tient qu'à être chanté, it means it matters for the territory to be sung. And the territory wouldn't exist. It's held only by the song of the birds, which means two different hypotheses and two different things. And for me, they were both important because I was trying to distribute the more possible, the largest I could, the agencies between all the being. The territory itself as a place should have some agencies in the fact that it makes the birds love it, sing it, and so on and so on. And the bird has to have some agency. So, and to distribute, so giving sometimes 2 or 3 meanings to a same word allow me to distribute the agencies between all the beings that are involved in the story. And it's impossible in English because the word in French work, but in English it's impossible to make it work. So I think that it's un moment de bravoure to translate me.
Very much. But I mean, there's also the word partition that in French
Well,
means,
for example, yes, it's complicated.
has clear meanings in French
Yes.
and really translated by one concept in English. So you do come across things like that.
And the syntax also was very difficult because in French I choose I choose a particular syntax, always in order to distribute the agencies and give as much agency I could give to the birds, to the ethologist, even to the flowers, to the plants, to the water, and so on. And for example, the best way to give much agencies to being, when we are speaking in a syntax that only accept either active voice or either passive voice, like our language is. So it's very difficult to distribute agencies with the use we have to give active voice to human and passive voice to other beings. And so I use what Bruno Latour taught us, which is the middle voice, la voix moyenne, which is a syntactic form that the Greek knew, but we don't cultivate anymore in Latin languages. And the best way to do it is to, what Latour says, is to invoke the make doing, or the faire. And so this is the middle voice. But in French, the middle voice, if you translate it almost literally from French to English, it sounds very awkward. It sounds very odd. And so it was also difficult because sometimes for stylistic reason, you were choosing the active voice or the passive voice. And I was telling you, no, you cannot. You have to be in the middle. Even if it's, but you, I say to Ellen, you are a writer. You like the style. You want the text to be beautiful. And I told you sometimes, this is too bad. It won't be beautiful, but we have to pass by that way of saying, even if it sounds so bizarre in English.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Because this was billed as in relationship with conversations that are being had or were being had in Glasgow in the last few days. And the one I'd like to finish on is the quotation to get you thinking, which I find both moving and also demanding. The quote from the beginning, I am convinced, along with Haraway, many others, that the multiplication of worlds can only make our world a better place. Creating such worlds means learning how to respect different ways of inhabiting a given space, identifying and itemizing what animals do, and how each of them has developed its own way of being. This is what I expect of researchers. and I use inhabiting, but in fact, cohabiting would be a better term, but there are no ways of inhabiting which are not almost cohabiting.
I think that I learned that with anthropologists, and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, whom I quote, says so nicely that finally the role of anthropology is not to discover the truth of another world, but to multiply the words. And I think that ethologists do that also. And that's why I love so much ethology. When I learn it in first, and I decide never to be a therapist, hopefully, fortunately, probably for all the people who could ask for help. Was not serious enough to do that kind of job. And what I wanted to say also is that I think that you mentioned Anthropocene, and to multiply the word, there are two things that I should mention. The first thing, that we are confronted with collapsology today, and a lot of people think that the world will disappear. And so if we multiply the world, what I mean, not only multiply actively, make them exist, but only to acknowledge of the existence of a great multiplicity of words, you cannot believe in collapsology so easily. Because of course, some words are disappearing, but other words are emerging, are springing. They are the zone à défendre in France. I'm sure you have that in England also. I mean, the practice of new commons are actually now being cultivated. The practice of commonings of a lot of young people are doing a lot of things. And I think that multiplying, acknowledging the way some words are multiplying is first of all a way of not accepting the way collapsology would condemn us to despair and to sidération, I would say, the fact not to be able to do anything. This is the first point. The second point is, of course, multiplying is also multiplying for non-human creature and recognizing that they home also, and let's see that they were, most of them, all of them were there before us. We were the last one to be on Earth. I mean, we believe we do. We are maybe some other beings. I mean, what does it mean anyway? More complicated than that. We don't know if new species are not created, and the grizzly and the polar bear together, is it a new species? Maybe they are the youngster of the world, but they don't behave like us. We were the youngster, and we believe that we have all the rights because we are the youngster. This is absolutely incredible. This is the second point. And the third point, I would like to mention that I wrote this book because I have a political agenda for writing this book. And this political agenda was clearly to show, because there were books like Robert Ardrey, the territorial imperative, which is such a disgusting pensando. And it was, and even Michel Serres did something that was not a good idea. So it was to open our imagination that territories and inhabiting can take so much more interesting shape and forms than private property and that appropriation. And all my quest was, will I find in birds not a model, because I don't want animals to be a model for humans. It doesn't work. And anyway, we know why it doesn't work. But to find a way to show the contingencies of our definition of territories, with borders, with conflicts, with appropriation, with being home, and so on and so on. And I really wanted birds to help us, like anthropologists do with the one they convoke to testimony of what human being is and is able to, and to ask the bird, to convoke the bird to open our imagination about the contingencies of our political choices and about other ways of inhabiting the world.
Vinciane, it's been an enormous pleasure. Thank you for doing the thinking and the writing of this. And thank idiots like me who can't read French. It's just a wonderful thing. Go out. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Garry. Thank you to all of you.